The arrival. David sat on his couch, scrolling through news updates on his tablet. The world had changed a lot in the last 10 years. Aliens were no longer a secret. Everyone knew about them. But even though they walked among humans, people still didn't trust them. Some were friendly, some were dangerous, and some, well, no one really knew. That's why, when David heard a loud knock on his apartment door, he wasn't expecting them. The knock came again, harder this time. David sighed and got up. He wasn't in the mood for visitors. But when he opened the door, he froze. 2 men in dark suits stood outside. Their faces were blank, emotionless. Government agents. David Carter. One of them asked. His voice was flat, robotic. Yeah. The second agent held out a sleek black tablet. Sign here. David frowned. What am I signing for? The first agent ignored the question. By signing, you agree to all terms and conditions. David glanced at the tablet. The screen showed a long contract filled with legal jargon. He couldn't understand half of it. But at the bottom, one sentence stood out in bold. You are being assigned an alien companion. You may do anything with her. David's breath caught in his throat. An alien companion. He had heard rumors about this program, but he thought it was just a conspiracy theory. Wait, he said. Why me? No answer. The agents just stared. Their patience was running out. David hesitated. His instincts told him this was a bad idea. But refusing the government was worse. He sighed, tapped the screen, and signed his name. The second agent nodded. Step aside. David moved back, and the agents carried a large metal crate into his apartment. It was about the size of a refrigerator, covered in thick black plating with no visible seams. A single red light blinked on its side. David stared at it. His chest tightened. One agent handed him a small remote. Just one button. Press it when you're ready, the agent said. Then, without another word, the 2 men walked out and shut the door behind them. David was alone, with the crate, and whatever was inside. The unveiling. David stood there for a long moment, the remote in his hand. His apartment felt too quiet now. Finally, he exhaled and pressed the button. With a low hiss, the crate unlocked. A seam appeared in the metal, and the front panel slid open with a smooth mechanical sound. Inside stood a woman, or at least she looked like one. She was tall, almost David's height, with smooth silver-blue skin that shimmered under the light. Her eyes were too large, too bright, too knowing. They were a deep shade of violet, with thin, vertical pupils like a cat's. Her hair was dark, straight, and reached past her shoulders. But it didn't seem like normal hair. It almost looked like thin strands of energy, softly glowing. She didn't move. She just stared at him. David swallowed. He had no idea what to say. Then suddenly she took a deep breath. Her chest rose as if she had just woken from a deep sleep. Her violet eyes locked onto his. David took a step back. He wasn't sure why, but something about the way she was looking at him made his skin crawl. She tilted her head slightly, observing him, studying him. Then she spoke. Her voice was soft, but carried an eerie calmness. You don't know what you have done. The warning. David's mouth went dry. What? He managed to say. She took a step forward, out of the crate. Her movements were too graceful, too controlled. She didn't seem afraid or confused. She seemed ready. I asked you a question, David said, his voice unsteady. What do you mean? She didn't answer. Instead, she smiled. But it wasn't a normal smile. It was small, calculated, like she was already 3 steps ahead of him in some kind of game. David's pulse quickened. This wasn't right. He glanced at the crate. On the inside of the door, he noticed something he hadn't seen before, a warning label. The words were small, almost hidden, but they made his stomach twist into knots. Do notif of warm, ATTCH, ni ent. Do not terrorist. Do not let here outside. David turned back to the alien woman. She was still smiling, and for the first time, he realized he might have just made a terrible mistake. The companion. David didn't sleep that night. He sat on the edge of his couch, his hands clasped together, eyes locked on the alien woman standing near his window. She hadn't moved in hours. She just stood there, gazing outside, her glowing violet eyes reflecting the neon lights of the city. Her presence filled the room, like an invisible force pressing against his chest. She wasn't normal. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't confused. She wasn't asking him questions. No, she was waiting. For what? David didn't know. He cleared his throat, trying to break the silence. So, do you have a name? The alien blinked slowly and turned to face him. Zyra. Her voice was soft, but too precise, like she was measuring every word before speaking. Zyra, David repeated. Okay. And you understand what's happening here, right? The government assigned you to me. You're supposed to be my bug. He hesitated, searching for the right word. Zyra tilted her head, amusement flickering in her violet eyes. Your companion. David exhaled. Yeah, that's what they called it. Zyra took a slow step forward, her bare feet making no sound on the floor. And what? She asked. Do you think that means? The question made David's stomach tighten. Because the truth was, he didn't know. The government had just given him an alien, as if she were an object, a tool, a pet. They told him he could do anything with her, but what did that really mean? And more importantly, why him? David shook his head. I have no idea what's going on. I didn't ask for this. I don't even know why they picked me. Zyra studied him for a long moment. Then she took another step closer. Her presence was intense, not threatening, but heavy, like standing next to something powerful that was only pretending to be harmless. Her voice dropped to a near whisper. Then you are already in danger. David's pulse spiked. What? Zyra looked at the door, then back at him. She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. Listen carefully. You need to understand something, David. This program, the one that brought me here, it's not what it seems. David's mouth went dry. What do you mean? She hesitated, then said something that made his entire body go cold. Every human who received a companion before you disappeared. The hidden truth. David felt like the room had just shrunk around him. Wait, what? He said, sitting up straight. That can't be right. The government wouldn't. Zyra cut him off. They don't tell the public. They erase the records. The people they choose are never seen again. David shook his head, trying to process her words. Then why am I still here? Why haven't they come for me? Zyra looked at the ceiling, her glowing eyes narrowing. They're watching. Right now. David's breath caught. He scanned the apartment, suddenly aware. The government had brought Zyra here. They had put her in his home. They could be listening. He stood up quickly and grabbed his phone, flipping it over, checking for anything strange. Then he looked at the walls, the vents, his skin prickling with paranoia. Zyra watched him, her expression unreadable. Looking for something. David exhaled sharply. Yeah. Bugs. Cameras. Something. Zyra smiled faintly. You won't find them. Why not? Because they don't need cameras. David froze. Zyra's eyes softened slightly. They'd put a tracker inside me. The experiment begins. David stepped back. Wait, inside you. Zyra nodded. They monitor everything I see, everything I hear, everything I say. They know we're having this conversation. David felt a chill crawl down his spine. Then why would you tell me this? Zyra's violet eyes locked onto his. Because I want to see what you do with the truth. Something in her expression shifted, something curious, like she was testing him. David rubbed his face, his mind racing. So let me get this straight. The government gave you to me, knowing full well that everyone before me disappeared. Correct. And they're watching us right now. Yes. David swallowed hard. And you're okay with that? Zura's lips curled into the smallest hint of a smirk. Who said I am? A heavy silence filled the room. David ran a hand through his hair. He had a dozen questions, but one stood out the most. Are you dangerous? Zura didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stepped forward until there was barely a foot between them. She tilted her head slightly, her violet eyes shimmering with something unreadable. Then she whispered, "Wouldn't you like to find out?" David's stomach twisted. Something about the way she said it. Not threatening, not reassuring, just curious. Like she wasn't even sure of the answer herself. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to think. All right. Fine. Let's say you're telling the truth. Let's say this whole thing is some kind of experiment. He gestured around the room. What happens now? Zura exhaled slowly. That depends on you. David frowned. What do you mean? She stepped past him and sat on the couch, her glowing gaze fixed on him. The others, they all followed the rules. They obeyed. They treated their alien companions like property. Her eyes darkened. And then they vanished. David's heart pounded. So if I don't follow the rules? Zura's lips curved into a small smile. Then maybe you survive. A beat of silence passed. David looked at the door, his mind racing. They were watching. The government was waiting to see what he would do next. And now so was Zira. His pulse quickened. He had just one question left. Was she his prisoner, or was he hers? The rules are fake. David didn't know how long he sat there, staring at the alien woman on his couch. Zira was too calm, too still. She didn't fidget like a human. She didn't blink as much as a human. And worst of all, she was watching him. Not like a person waiting for a conversation to continue, but like a predator waiting to see what her prey would do next. The weight of her words pressed down on him. Every human who had received an alien companion before him had disappeared. And now, the government was watching his every move. He exhaled, rubbing his temples. Okay, fine. Let's say this whole thing is a trap. Let's say I'm already in danger. What do I do now? Zura's lips curved slightly. That depends. On what? She leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. On whether you plan to survive. A test of control. David stood up and started pacing. All right. If they're watching, then they must have rules, right? Some kind of expectations for how I act. What I do. Zira nodded slightly. Yes. They want to see if you'll follow orders. If you'll treat me like an object. David frowned. Like a pet. Her expression darkened. Like a slave. A chill ran down his spine. That's what this program is, David. An experiment. They don't care about companionship. They care about control. David swallowed. Then they expect me to tell you what to do. Zara tilted her head slightly, studying him. Then, in a low voice, she asked, "Do you want to?" David hesitated. The way she asked that, it wasn't just a question. It was a challenge. The government had told him he could do anything with her. They wanted to see what he would do. Would he act like a master? Would he test his power? He exhaled sharply. All right. Fine. Let's test it. Zura's eyebrows lifted slightly. Go on. David crossed his arms. Stand up. For a moment, she didn't move. Then, slowly, she rose to her feet. Walked to the kitchen. Zura took a single step toward the kitchen, then stopped. She turned her head slightly, her glowing violet eyes locking onto his. You see how easy it is, she murmured, to slip into the role they want. David clenched his jaw. I was testing them, not you. Zura's smile was faint. Were you? David's hands curled into fists. He was already playing into the government's game. They wanted to see how far he would go. And if Zira was right, that was exactly what had gotten the others killed. Breaking the rules. David took a deep breath. Okay, then let's do the opposite. Zira raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? David grabbed his jacket from the chair. They expect me to keep you inside. They expect me to follow the rules. So let's break them. Zira's smile grew. Now you're thinking like a survivor. Without waiting, David walked to the door and opened it. A rush of cool night air filled the apartment. The city outside was alive with neon lights, flashing signs, and the constant hum of air traffic. Zira hesitated, glancing at the open doorway. Problem? David asked. She tilted her head slightly. No, I was just wondering if you were the kind of man who jumps before thinking about where he'll land. David exhaled. Guess we're about to find out. Zira stepped forward, and together, they crossed the threshold. The first warning. The moment they stepped outside, David's skin prickled with unease. Nothing felt wrong, but something in the air had changed. They walked down the dimly lit corridor of his apartment complex, past closed doors and flickering hallway lights. Then, suddenly, click. David froze. The sound had been quiet, but distinct. A camera. Zira turned her head slightly. They know. David clenched his fists. He forced himself to keep walking, acting like nothing was wrong. If the government was watching, he couldn't let them know he was afraid. But then, the elevator at the end of the hall dinged. The doors slid open, and inside stood two men in black suits. The chase begins. David didn't wait. He grabbed Zira's wrist and bolted. The men moved instantly, stepping out of the elevator. No words, no warning, just pursuit. David's heart pounded. Stairs, he shouted. They dashed down the corridor and slammed through the stairwell door. How fast can you run? David asked between breaths. Zira's lips twitched into a smirk. Faster than you. Then what are you waiting for? Zira moved. One moment she was next to him. The next she was a blur of motion, racing down the stairs like gravity barely applied to her. David pushed himself harder, lungs burning, feet slamming against the steps. He risked a glance back. The agents were gaining. They weren't running full speed. They didn't need to. They were hurting him. Shit. They weren't trying to stop him yet. They were waiting to trap him in a dead end. The impossible leap. Zira skidded to a stop at a landing, looking at the railing. David reached her just as she turned to him. We need another way out, she said. David's chest heaved. Do you see one? She glanced down. The ground floor was 5 stories below. David blinked. Don't even think about it. Zira took his hand. What? And then she jumped. David had just enough time to shout before gravity disappeared. Air rushed around them, lights and shadows blurring past. Then, just as David braced for impact, they stopped. No crash, no broken bones. Zira landed as if the laws of physics were just a suggestion. David stumbled back, gasping. What the hell? She grabbed his arm and pulled him forward. No time for questions. Run. And so they did. Behind them, the agents reached the stairwell railing and looked down. They didn't jump. They didn't rush. One of them pulled out a communicator. They made contact, initiating secondary protocol. Then he looked directly at the fleeing figures, his face blank, his voice cold. Subject Zira is fully active. Prepare for containment. David and Zira disappeared into the city lights. And the real hunt began. The escape. The night air was thick with tension. Neon lights flickered across the rain-slick streets as David and Zira ran, their footsteps echoing against the towering buildings of the city. David's heart pounded like a war drum in his chest, every beat reminding him how dangerously close they were to being caught. Behind them, the government agents weren't running anymore. They didn't need to. They had something far more terrifying. David heard it before he saw it. a low mechanical hum. Then, the streetlights flickered, and the air pulsed with static electricity. Zira yanked him into a narrow alley just as the drones appeared overhead. Sleek, black, and completely silent, they hovered in the air like predatory birds scanning for prey. Their lenses glowed red, locking onto their targets. David pressed his back against the cold brick wall, trying to steady his breathing. "Tell me you have a plan." Zira's violet eyes glowed faintly in the dark. "Run fast, hide well, and don't get shot." David exhaled sharply. Fantastic plan. Really inspiring. Before she could respond, a beam of blue light cut through the air, slicing clean through a street lamp. David's stomach dropped. Oh, come on. The drones had weapons. Of course they did. Zira grabbed his wrist. "Move." They dashed through the alley, ducking under rusted fire escapes, leaping over scattered trash bins. A low whirring noise followed them. The drones were scanning, locking on. Zira suddenly skidded to a halt. David nearly crashed into her. "Why are we stopping?" She didn't answer. Instead, she raised a hand toward the drone nearest to them. The air crackled. A pulse of unseen energy shot out from her fingertips, and the drone twitched violently midair, then exploded in a burst of sparks. David gaped. "You could do that the whole time." Zira exhaled slowly, swaying slightly. "Not often. Costs too much energy." David looked up. 2 more drones hovered above them, adjusting their aim. "Then let's not stick around to see what happens next." They ran. The city turns against them. The city was alive with lights and sounds, hover cars, flashing billboards, the distant murmur of late-night crowds. But David had never felt more alone. They weren't just being chased. They were being funneled. Every street they turned onto, every alley they tried to slip through, something was waiting. A drone. An unmarked black car. A silent figure in a suit, standing in the shadows, watching. David clenched his jaw. "They're hurting us." Zira glanced at him. "They don't want to kill us." David gave her an incredulous look. "Oh yeah, tell that to the laser drones." She shook her head. "If they wanted us dead, we'd already be dead. They need me alive." David didn't like the way she said me, and not us. Still, she was right. The government wanted Zira, and whatever experiment they had planned, it wasn't finished yet. David grabbed her arm and pulled her toward a crowded marketplace. The streets were lined with food stalls, flickering neon signs, and vendors shouting at passersby. The scent of grilled meat and oil filled the air, mingling with the sharp tang of rain on metal. David exhaled. "We blend in here." Zira hesitated. "It won't last long." "Then let's make it count." Nowhere left to run. They wove through the crowd, moving fast but careful not to draw attention. David tried to keep his breathing steady, but his mind was racing. This wasn't just random bad luck. The government had been prepared for this. They expected him to run. Which meant David's stomach twisted. They had a backup plan. And then he heard it. A distant, mechanical voice. Calm, cold, final. "Attention, citizens. A fugitive and an unauthorized alien have been identified in this district. Please remain where you are. Compliance ensures safety." The entire marketplace froze. The air shifted. David felt the weight of hundreds of eyes slowly turning toward them. Then, like a slow-moving tide, the people around them started backing away. Zira whispered, "They turned the city against us." David's blood ran cold. The government didn't need to chase them anymore. They had trapped them in plain sight. Betrayed. A vendor, a man who had been laughing with customers just moments ago, suddenly reached under his stall and pulled out a small device. A locator beacon. David barely had time to react before the man slammed his palm onto the button. A sharp, high-pitched alarm shrieked through the air. The crowd scattered, and from the far end of the market, the agents arrived. David saw 6 of them emerge from the shadows, dressed in sleek black armor, their faces hidden behind mirrored visors. One of them raised a hand. Target acquired. Zira grabbed David's arm. We're out of time. They turned, only to see 3 more agents blocking the other end of the market. David's chest tightened. They were surrounded. The leader of the agents took a step forward. His voice was perfectly calm. There is nowhere left to run. Zura's grip on David's wrist tightened. Then, softly, she whispered, "I didn't want to do this." David barely had time to process her words before everything exploded. Zura's true power. A shockwave erupted from Zura's body, an invisible force that sent the nearest agents flying backward like ragdolls. The air hummed with energy. Zura's silver-blue skin flared with light, and her violet eyes burned with an unnatural glow. Her hair lifted slightly, charged with static electricity. David stumbled back. What the? Zura moved. She was faster than the human eye could follow. 1 second she was standing beside him. The next, she was in front of the nearest agent, her hand raised. The agent barely had time to react before Zura touched his chest. A crackling pulse of energy rippled outward, and the agent collapsed. David's breath caught. What did you do?" Zura turned to him, her expression unreadable. "This is why they want me," she murmured. More agents rushed forward. Zura lifted her hand. The world went white. David felt gravity disappear. For a single terrifying moment, he was weightless, floating. Then the energy collapsed, and everything slammed back into place. When the light faded, the agents were on the ground, unmoving. Zura stood in the center of it all, her glowing violet eyes locking onto David's. "They will keep coming," she whispered, "unless we stop them first." David swallowed hard. "You mean? Fight back." Zura's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "Now you're thinking like me." The city lights flickered. Sirens screamed in the distance. And David realized there was no going back now. The betrayal. The city was still burning behind them. Sirens howled through the night, blue and red lights flashing against the steel skyline. Smoke rose from the marketplace, and the streets were alive with movement, police, drones, and government enforcers searching for the fugitives. David and Zura. David's breath came fast and uneven as he ran, his body aching from the explosion's shockwave. Zura moved beside him, unfazed, her silver-blue skin still faintly glowing from the surge of power she had unleashed. They had escaped. For now. But David knew the truth. They weren't running away anymore. They were being hunted. Nowhere is safe. They stopped in the shadows of an abandoned construction site. Half-built skyscrapers loomed over them, their steel skeletons reaching into the night sky like broken fingers. The hum of search drones echoed in the distance, their red lights sweeping across the empty streets. David leaned against a concrete pillar, trying to catch his breath. "This isn't working," he said between gulps of air. "We need a plan," Zura finished. David nodded. "We can't keep running. We need somewhere safe." Zura tilted her head slightly, studying him. "And you think such a place exists?" David hesitated. That's when he felt it, his hand still clutching his communicator. He had almost forgotten. There was one person who could help them. A dangerous friend. David pressed a few quick commands into the small device. A holographic map flickered to life, a private communication channel. He hesitated, then pressed the call button. The device beeped twice. Then a deep voice answered. "David." David exhaled. "I need help, Kane." A pause. Then, "Where are you?" David glanced at Zura. She gave him a silent warning look, but he ignored it. Abandoned district, near the old tram lines. Another pause. Then Kane's voice lowered. "You've got heat on you, don't you?" David swallowed. "Big time." Kane sighed. "Stay put. I'll send a ride." The call cut off. David tucked the communicator into his pocket and turned to Zira. "There. Back up." Zira didn't look convinced. "You trust him?" David hesitated. Kane was an old friend, someone who had worked on the other side of the law. He had access to resources, underground connections. He had helped David before when the government started tightening its grip on the city. But trust? David wasn't sure anymore. "It's our best shot," he said. Zira's violet eyes locked onto his. "Or our biggest mistake." The trap springs. The car arrived 20 minutes later. A sleek black transport vehicle, unmarked, moving too smoothly through the streets to be anything but illegal. David and Zira climbed into the back. The doors locked behind them. The driver wore a dark coat and a visor that hid his eyes. He nodded but didn't speak. The vehicle accelerated, weaving through the city's underground roads, away from the main surveillance routes. David exhaled, finally feeling a moment of safety. Then, he turned to Zira. "See, it's fine." Zira didn't look at him. She was staring at the driver. And then, softly, she said, "Turn the car around." The driver didn't react. David frowned. "Zira, what are you?" "Now." Zira's voice was sharp, cold, commanding. The driver still didn't move. Then, the doors locked again. David's stomach twisted. Something was wrong. He reached for the door handle. Nothing. The lock wouldn't budge. The driver finally spoke. His voice was calm. Too calm. "Destination locked. Stand by for arrival." David's chest tightened. Kane wouldn't. Zira placed a hand on his arm. "He already has." Betrayed. The car slowed. Outside the tinted windows, David could see figures waiting. Black suits, reflective visors, government agents. David felt his stomach drop. No, 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 no. The car doors unlocked with a soft hiss. The driver turned slightly, his visor reflecting David's wide-eyed expression. "You should have known, Carter," he said. Then the doors swung open, and the agents surrounded them. David barely had time to react before hands grabbed him. Strong, unyielding. Zira fought. Lightning fast, she twisted free, her hands glowing with energy. She slammed her palm into the nearest agent's chest. A pulse of violet light rippled outward, sending him flying. Another agent lunged. Zira dodged. A second pulse of energy sent him crashing into the side of the transport vehicle. David struggled, but the agents were stronger, trained, prepared. A cold metal barrel pressed against his neck. "Don't move," a voice ordered. David froze. Zira saw it. The gun. The weapon aimed directly at David's skull. And for the first time since they met, she hesitated. A cruel smile formed on one of the agent's lips. "You don't want him to die, do you?" David saw it in her face. She could kill all of them right now. But not fast enough. Not before they pulled the trigger. Her hands stopped glowing. The agent grinned. "Good girl." David felt his chest tighten. No, 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 no. A sharp sting in his neck. The world blurred. His body collapsed. He barely heard Zira shout his name before everything went dark. Captured. David's head was pounding when he woke up. The first thing he noticed was the cold. Metal. He was strapped to a chair. His arms were locked down, his legs immobile. The room was dim, the walls sleek and sterile. A laboratory. A containment cell. Then he saw her. Zira. She was across from him, restrained differently, her arms suspended in the air by sleek, glowing cuffs. Her silver blue skin flickered between dim and bright, as if something was draining her energy. David struggled. Zira. She lifted her head slowly. Her violet eyes were dimmer now, but they still held defiance. A door slid open. A man entered. David had never seen him before, but the air in the room shifted, like his presence alone was enough to make the walls colder. He wore a gray suit, no tie. His face was lean, sharp, with calculating eyes that had seen too much. He smiled. "Welcome back, Mr. Carter," he said. David's blood ran cold. Whoever this man was, he was in charge. The ultimate decision. David's world swam in and out of focus, his head pounding from whatever drug they had pumped into his system. The sterile white lights above him flickered slightly, their cold glow reflecting off the metal walls of the interrogation chamber. His wrists were bound to the chair with unbreakable restraints, cold steel biting into his skin. Across from him, Zaira hung suspended in the air, her arms stretched above her, bound by glowing energy cuffs. Her silver-blue skin flickered weakly, her usual luminous glow dimmed, as if something was draining the life from her. David struggled against his restraints, but they didn't budge. His throat was dry, his heart pounding in his chest. They had them. And now, the man in charge had entered the room. The man in the gray suit. He wasn't an agent. He wasn't some nameless soldier in a black suit. He was something worse. The man wore a sleek gray suit, no tie. He looked unbothered, completely at ease, like everything was unfolding exactly as he had planned. His sharp, lean face bore no emotion, just the calculated calm of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. David felt a chill crawl down his spine. The man clasped his hands behind his back and took slow, measured steps toward them. "David Carter," he said smoothly. "And subject Zaira. Quite the mess you've made for us." David gritted his teeth. "Sorry to inconvenience you," he muttered. The man smirked. "No, you're not." He turned slightly, studying Zaira like one might study a rare animal in a cage. "And you," he mused, "you have exceeded expectations." Zaira didn't respond. She was watching him. Not with fear, not even with anger, but with understanding. David saw it. She knew something he didn't. The man exhaled, adjusting his cuffs. "Tell me, Carter, what do you think this is all about?" David glared at him. "I think you're a bunch of sick bastards running experiments on people who didn't sign up for them." The man's lips curled slightly. A crude but not entirely incorrect assessment. "But tell me, do you know what she really is?" David glanced at Zaira. "An alien you people kidnapped and turned into a lab rat." The man chuckled. "Oh, if only it were that simple." He leaned closer, his voice lowering. "She's not just an alien, Mr. Carter. She's a prototype, a weapon, the first of her kind." David's heart skipped a beat. Zaira remained silent. The man continued. "You think we captured her? No, we created her." David's breath caught. "Liar," he spat. The man in gray smirked. "Believe what you want. But Zaira." He turned to her. "You know the truth, don't you?" Zaira's violet eyes burned into him. "You didn't create me," she said softly. "But you did reprogram me." David froze. The man's smirk widened. "Ah, so you do remember." David turned to Zaira, his mind racing. What is he talking about? She closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, they were filled with something David had never seen before. Sadness. "They didn't take me from my people," she said quietly. "They made me forget them." David's stomach dropped. "You mean?" The man in gray folded his hands behind his back again. "A mind is a delicate thing, Carter. With the right tools, you can erase, rewrite, redefine. Zaira is the most advanced bioengineered entity ever created. The first successful fusion of human and non-human intelligence. She was supposed to be our breakthrough. A perfect companion." His eyes darkened. But instead, she became a liability. The choice. The door behind him slid open, and 2 armored guards stepped inside. They carried something between them. A second chair, identical to David's, but empty. David's pulse quickened. The man in gray turned to him. "You are in a unique position, Mr. Carter," he said. You are the first human subject who has lasted this long with Zura. You didn't break. You didn't disappear. His eyes gleamed. You adapted. David felt his blood turn cold. And that presents us with an interesting opportunity. The man continued. Zura was meant to be humanity's perfect partner. Intelligent, obedient, loyal. We could never quite perfect that last part. He gestured to the empty chair. But maybe, with your help, we can. David's throat was dry. You want me to help you break her? The man smiled. Not break. Reprogram. Imagine, Carter, a being with Zura's power, but with absolute loyalty. A guardian. A protector. A weapon that never questions orders. His voice was hypnotic, weaving its way into David's mind. You could be the first, the man said. The first to bond with her properly. The first to shape what she becomes. You could be a part of history. David glanced at Zura. She didn't speak, but her eyes. They weren't just sad anymore. They were pleading. The man in gray straightened. Or, of course, you could refuse. The guards raised their weapons. And we wipe you instead. The words hit David like a hammer. He looked at the empty chair. If he agreed, Zura would become exactly what the government wanted. A weapon with no free will. If he refused, they would erase his mind. Or worse. David clenched his fists. His heart pounded so hard, he thought it might break his ribs. He had to decide. Help them or die. And Zura would never be free. His mind raced. His breath was shallow. And then, Zura spoke. David. Her voice was quiet, but full of meaning. He met her eyes. And in that instant, he knew. There was a third option. One the man in gray hadn't considered. David exhaled slowly. Then he looked up at the man in gray and smiled. All right, he said. I'll help. The man in gray grinned. And David made his final decision. He wasn't going to break Zura. He was going to set her free. The reckoning. David's words hung in the air like a loaded gun. All right, I'll help. The man in the gray suit smiled, clearly pleased. Smart choice, Mr. Carter. David forced himself to keep his face neutral. He had just lied to one of the most dangerous men on the planet. Now he had to make sure he survived long enough to make it count. Zura was still suspended in her restraints, her violet eyes locked onto his. She didn't speak, but David saw the flicker of understanding. She knew. She knew he had a plan. The problem was, he had no idea if it would work. The preparation for betrayal. The guards released David's restraints. His arms throbbed from being held down so long, but he didn't have time to think about that. The man in gray gestured toward the empty chair, the one meant for him. Sit. David hesitated for only a moment before doing as he was told. The guard strapped him in, securing his wrists and ankles. Not as tightly as Zura's, but enough to remind him who was in control. The man in gray adjusted his cuffs. Now, let's begin. A soft hiss filled the room as a needle-thin device lowered from the ceiling. It stopped inches from David's forehead. David's pulse spiked. I assume you're familiar with neural synchronization, the man asked. David swallowed. Can't say it was part of my high school curriculum. The man smirked. A pity. You would have found it fascinating. He gestured toward Zura. This process will link your mind to hers, every thought, every command. If you do this correctly, she will no longer be a wild card. She will be yours, and in return, you will be ours. David forced a shaky breath. And if I resist? The man smiled thinly. Then we wipe you clean, and we find someone else. The needle device whirred, its tip glowing faintly. David glanced at Zura. She didn't blink, didn't speak. But in her eyes, he saw it. The plan. The unspoken promise. She was waiting. Waiting for the right moment. The desperate gamble. The needle lowered to his skin. A sharp jolt of electricity shot through David's skull, searing pain flooding his mind. It was like someone had shoved their hands into his brain, sifting through his thoughts, tearing apart everything that made him him. For a terrifying moment, he felt Zura. Not physically, mentally. A whisper at the edge of his consciousness. A presence that wasn't his own. And then, a voice. David. It wasn't spoken. It was inside him. David's heart pounded. She was already inside. The synchronization process was working. But not the way they had planned. David clenched his fists against the chair's armrests. What do I do? Zyra's response was instant. Trust me. And then, the power in the facility went out, unleashing the monster. The room plunged into darkness. A second later, red emergency lights flickered on, casting everything in an eerie crimson glow. The guards shouted. Weapons were drawn. But Zira was already free. The power surge had overloaded her restraints, and she moved like a specter, her energy-infused body crackling with electricity. David had seconds to act. He yanked his wrists free. The power disruption had temporarily weakened the locks. His legs stumbled as he pushed forward. An alarm blared, echoing through the facility. Security BREHH. Containment failure. The guards aimed their weapons. Zira vanished. Not physically. She moved too fast for the human eye to follow. And then, carnage. She took down the first guard with a single, effortless strike to the chest. A pulse of violet light sent his body crumpling like a broken puppet. The second guard fired. Zira caught the bullet midair. David barely had time to process it before she turned, hurling the projectile back at the shooter, not fast enough to kill, but enough to knock the weapon from his hand. The man in gray was gone. David cursed. He's running. Zira grabbed his arm. Then we run faster. They burst through the door. The escape through hell. The facility was in chaos. Sirens blared. Drones zipped through the halls, scanning for targets. Security teams scrambled to contain the breach, but they had never planned for Zira at full strength. David sprinted beside her, his heart pounding. Where the hell are we going? Zira's voice was eerily calm. Out. A security checkpoint loomed ahead. Heavily armed guards. Automated turrets. A dead end. David skidded to a stop. We can't. Zira raised her hands. A pulse of pure energy erupted from her palms, short-circuiting every turret, every drone, every electronic system in sight. David's mouth fell open. You've been holding back. Zira smirked. You wouldn't have survived the full version. They sprinted through the wreckage. The exit was ahead. A final steel door, reinforced, locked, impenetrable. David's stomach sank. We're trapped. Zira's hand glowed. She slammed her palm against the door. The entire wall buckled outward. Metal screamed. The door, a foot-thick barricade of steel, was ripped clean off its hinges. Wind rushed in, the outside world. They were free. The final confrontation. Except, standing in the doorway, was the man in gray. Unarmed. Calm. Watching them. You think you've won, he said smoothly. Zira didn't stop moving. She strode toward him, the air crackling with power. You can't stop me, she said. The man tilted his head. No, he admitted, but I can offer you something better. David clenched his jaw. Bullshit. You're stalling. The man smiled faintly. Am I? He looked at Zira. And then he said something that made her stop cold. Your memories. I can give them back. David's stomach dropped. Zira froze. For the first time since they met. She hesitated. The man's smile widened. Come back with me, Zira. We don't have to be enemies. Let us finish the process. Restore what was taken. Make you whole again. Silence. David's breath caught. Zira's hands stopped glowing. Zira, David whispered. She turned to him. A choice. Freedom. or the past. David's chest tightened. Then, slowly, she smiled and punched the man in the face. His body collapsed like a house of cards. She turned back to David. "Let's go." And together, they ran into the night, free, at last.